very much to Darko and Katja for the invitation, and thank you for coming. I have a very straightforward lesson for you straight away. Always be aware, no matter how long you're doing this, that technology will let you down. Always have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D. So you may have noticed that Katja and Darko were feverishly trying to help me. I had a fancy new Apple laptop that doesn't save onto PowerPoint, so all of the newer work for the presentation is kind of wasted. So this is a slightly older version. And I think what I'll do is that the various projects I'm going to talk about, I'll send Darko and Katja, once we get a break, I'll send them a list of the URLs that they can forward to you tomorrow so that you don't have to worry about taking the stuff down today. So we'll work with it. I should also start off by saying I'm glad that I'm following on from Katja's paper, because we're moving from a context which is suffused with sex to various contexts in which sex is very much suppressed. So we're going in the opposite direction. And so what I wanted to do in the time that I have today really is, the reason they invited me, I think, to speak is because I was leading a big digital humanities project on women's writing from 2014 to 2020. It's still ongoing, but the funding ends. That's the other lesson. If you get the funding never continues eternally. So you have to build in contingencies for that kind of thing. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that project, which is maybe of interest mainly as a digital humanities project to you, because my own area of expertise is 16th and 17th century women's writing, and I know most of you are interested in turn of the century women's writing. So don't worry, I won't be giving you a historical account of this stuff. But I want to maybe show you the genesis of kind of digital humanities projects concerned with women's writing. Because once you start thinking about sexual desire unbound, you realise that this is kind of a field that's ripe for you guys to exploit. What will become clear by the end of the talk, when I talk you through some kind of experiments with some of these projects and trying to search for desire, is how little there is. So this is really ripe, fertile ground for you. So I'll start off maybe with a little bit about my own project, which was called Reset, which is a shortened version of a really long name, which is the reception and circulation of early modern women's writing. So reception, circulation, banded together for short. And these were the research questions that we had at the start, and maybe it might be interesting to talk at the end of the day about how they map onto the research questions that Katja has, which are very precise, and that might actually be more useful. It might deliver a different kind, will deliver a different kind of set of results to really broad questions like these. And we were responding to a period in the 1980s and the 1990s where a huge amount of work had been done, more in the Anglophone sphere than in the non-Anglophone sphere, on recovering women's writing for history. And we kind of thought, okay, so we've got all of these texts written by women, but what kind of an impact do they make? So which women writers were actually in circulation in the period? You might be writing something by hand and just giving it to your friend, but no one beyond your friend might see it. So which women writers were in circulation? Where did their texts go? Who, if anybody, read them? And how were they being read or used or recycled or repurposed? You might find a nice line and decide you're going to use that line in your own poem. So these are the kinds of big questions that we wanted to ask. And I'll start us off with just a couple of 17th century examples. This is, sorry, we're looking at this as well because I have my newer presentation down here. So this is from a letter sent by nowadays a very well-known canonical woman writer in English language writing, Catherine Phillips. She wrote plays and poems and letters to a friend of hers, Charles Bottle, in 1662. And this is what we would say an example of the reception of an elegy, a poem, by the French writer, the Comtesse de la Suze. And so she's writing to her friend about having read the Countess of Suze's elegy, which is indeed one of the finest poems of that nature I ever read. The thoughts are great and noble, and represented to the life the vastness of her excellent soul. The language is pure and hardly to be paralleled. I return you many thanks for it and assure you I will always keep it with a value worthy of the author, who must needs be an extraordinary woman, and of the sender, who is to me above all the rest. So he had sent her the poem, and she's now writing to say what she thinks of it. I'll come back maybe when we turn to desire towards the end, at the language in which this is all framed. You know, the discourses of purity, of excellence, of exceptionality. This is kind of what's appropriate for a 17th century writer to be lauded for, not she articulated sexual desire, which is what we might be interested in today. Another example, which also, sorry, I don't know why that came out the way it did, which also, so this is an example of someone writing about another 17th century writer, Elizabeth Jocelyn, and the particular bit that I wanted to pick out, which hasn't come through here, is talking about her holy, remarking she wrote that excellent piece called The Mother's Legacy to Her Unborn Child. So a very popular former 17th century print bestseller was A Mother's Legacy. When women thought they might die in childbirth, they would write a legacy instruction manual to their child who they may never meet. And this woman writer is being praised for that. She wrote that excellent piece where one may see her holy life and conversation, not without amazement. So again, the idea of the exceptionality of women's writing, and that's what they're being picked up for in the 17th century. So this is the kind of evidence, this is the kind of material that we were looking for to try and find evidence of what did people at the time think about women writers. This is a reminder, we've all got a little older, I think, since this picture was taken, but this is just there as a reminder that this kind of work is always collaborative. You just can't do this stuff on your own. You need teams of people, even if you don't have the money, like-minded collaborators who can talk this stuff through with you, like we'll be doing this week. So that was the original research team. And I wanted then to maybe, before I get into research in detail, talk you through the genesis of our project, where it came from, and the earlier kind of pioneering digital humanities projects relating to women's writing that existed when we started. One of these, which is in my my new thing, is the Women Writers Project. And in fact, I just quickly went on the internet to give you a sense of that. So this is the Women Writers Project, which is an American project that started in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And they were concerned firstly with trying to recover women's writing, so to make available online editions of texts that had been printed by women, so only print culture in English from, what it says here, the Women Writers Online collection contains more than 450 texts published between 1526 and 1850. And once they spent about 10 years doing that, they tagged the texts. So I know you'll be talking in a few days about the text encoding initiative and how to tag texts, how to kind of encode them. That's a huge part of what these guys did, as part of why they were pioneering. They tagged all of these texts to make them searchable. But one of the things that they've done since is develop a whole series of kind of sister sites that are about the context for these texts. So the Women Writers Project Lab here is an experimental online digital lab that they have. Women Writers in Context is a whole selection of open access, not open access, are they? Materials that they've made available to kind of help us make sense of the text that they first made available. And I thought you might be interested particularly in Women Writers in Review, which is a collection of reviews in periodical literature of women's writing that were published in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And they have some interesting ways to visualize they've codified them from negative to positive and in between, so that you can kind of start making connections. The main value, I suppose, of digital humanities projects is, as you saw from what Kathy said, the making of connections between texts and the seeing of bigger scale patterns. And so something like Women Writers in Review is trying to make available the patterns that we can see, the connections between the reviews, people's attitudes to women, that kind of thing. Another of the kind of grandmother texts, grandmother projects here is Orlando. And I suppose the disadvantage of both Orlando and WWO is that they're both subscription only. One of the great developments since these pioneering projects has been the development of easy to manage open source software and open access databases. In the early days, there wasn't really research funding available, so you went to a publisher, and that meant that the publisher had to charge people to use the materials. So that's The advantage of that is it gives you sustainability. You don't have to worry about contingency planning. The downside is your university library or somewhere, your national library, has to subscribe to it. You have to convince them to do it. So Orlando was another one which started off with women's writing in the British Isles from the beginnings, by which they mean kind of the 17th, 18th century to the present. And they were not trying to produce a library of texts authored by women. They wanted to produce a text base which is also TEI encoded of scholarship about women's writing. And again, trying to enable people to make a connection. So by doing all the coding and the tagging, enabling people, I'm not sure if they're any good examples of this here. I'll dig out some good examples after and send you some links. Allowing people to plot their own route through. So if you're interested in gender issues is one of their tags. Probably too huge to give you something interesting in their text base, which are those kinds of tagging which you can follow through kind of a certain theme. And the idea is that presents the information in a new way, it makes visible new things that we haven't thought of, raises new research questions. Okay, so there's some of the grandmother sister projects that inspired us. Here's another open access one, which is contingent on one of the university where the person who founded this, Elizabeth Clark, she's now retired, and it's dependent on every now and then this goes dead because no one in the university is there to keep an eye on it, and an army of academics around the globe write them going, no, you've let Perdita down again, get it back up. So this was attempting to supplement the other project we talked about by looking at manuscript writing, so handwritten writing, because it turns out, of course, for all the reasons that Katia has outlined, earlier women's writing is generally circulated quite widely, but in handwritten form, because to publicly publish your work in print is opening yourself up to all kinds of social problems and accusations. So this is all based on Anglophone women's manuscripts and uncovered kind of hundreds of new writers that people didn't know about. It got picked up by a publishing company called Adam Matthew, who specialised in digital publications, and so they thought it was useful enough that they developed a kind of a higher spec, nicer looking version of this, but it's subscription only. And then the other one, which is how myself and Katia first met each other, was the Women Writers in History group, which is an international one, pioneered really by a Dutch project led by a woman called Suzanne van Dijk. It was about the reception of women writers, and she initially got funding on a Dutch level, and then got European funding to widen the network so that people across Europe who were interested in these topics could come together, which is where we first met. And it was kind of a free, open access database of, in all the languages, receptions of all kinds of women's writing, up to 1900. And we all kind of shared our data, that's what that was before. That database is now moving from, for a long time it was hosted in the Netherlands by the Halkens Institute, which is their national research institute. And it's now moving, it's in the process of migrating to Radboud University, which is one of the universities in the Netherlands. So it's not available at the moment, but we hope in the next year it'll be back up and running again. So these are the kinds of contexts for this kind of work, the kinds of projects that are operating. I'll skip that one. Early modern letters online is probably interesting, especially because I know that Darko will be discussing his letters project later today. This is a project that, again, is probably northwest Europe rather than across the whole of Europe, but it's trying to bring together scientific writers, people who are corresponding to each other about scientific issues, and making all of that information available. And as a sub-project, they realised when they got up and running and got some attention that they'd excluded a lot of women. So they then founded Wemlo, which ran for a few years, but no longer in a happy way really exists because women's early modern letters online has been fully incorporated to early modern letters online. There's another kind of interesting thing about the way these ideologies can shift and change. You point this out to people now and they go, oh, we're really stupid, let's put some money into that and let's rectify the whole problem. Okay, so back to our project then. Maybe I won't talk for too long about our project. So what we were interested in was reception and circulation. And to come back to what Katia was saying about being clear about your research questions, you need to try and be clear about what your parameters are, what your definitions are going to be at the start as well. So we came up with the definition that a reception, because we wanted to capture the widest possible range of reactions and responses to women's writing, we decided that a reception for us would be a record of engagement with a female author and or her work. So this includes a lot of stuff that might be pejorative about women. If we people say that a writer like Catherine Phillips was a prostitute, that goes in. That's part of the reception for us. And they mightn't even be talking about the actual work that she wrote. It might just be female author's name, here's what I think of her, that goes in. So we're deliberately having a very, very wide view because we wanted to capture the widest possible sense of what was going on in the period. But there were a lot of historians of reading who would say this is too wide. You know, a historian of reading might limit it only to the female author's work. They're only interested in people responding to the writing rather than responding to the idea of the female author. And our definition of circulation then was a record of where a female author's work went. And this generally meant looking at book lists and catalogues of libraries to find out, you know, what kind of a book collector in the 17th or 18th century would include women's writing, and trying to kind of pore over lists. And the kind of work that I love, not everyone loves sitting down and going through book lists of the 17th and 18th century, but anyway. The other thing that's important to say about that question of defining your research questions, defining your terms, is we had to come up with a hypothesis as to where were we likely to find this kind of evidence. And so we came up with 4 categories of materials that we were going to look at, but that might be excluded other categories of material. So we have hypothesized in the first instance that transnational religious networks, by which really I mean Catholic religious networks, were likely to yield examples of people responding to women's writing, because nuns are one of the categories of early modern women that were encouraged to write, that were encouraged to read, that were encouraged to translate lives of saints and that kind of thing. So we thought, okay, we can kind of look at communities of nuns, that's where we might find some evidence. Secondly, we looked at scientific correspondence networks, partly inspired by early modern letters online. We've been looking at scientific correspondence networks. In fact, we looked at one of the best known that kind of was grounded in England by a Polish man called Samuel Hartleb, who was kind of a linchpin of this huge pan-European network of scientists. And we looked at his network first, and we ended up having so much evidence of women's involvement in that network that we never got beyond. We ran out of money and time before we could get to any other correspondence network. So a lot of, I suppose, the value of what we were able to do is show that there is lots of material there, but we weren't able to get to the end of the material. And that's maybe another thing to think about with DH projects. If you're not going to be able to continue going on and on, part of you will be sorry about, but I know there's so much more there, if I could only keep on going to just another library. Sometimes you have to stand up, look, we've proven it's there. That means other researchers can go out and find stuff too. The third category we looked at was the manuscript miscellany. This is kind of a manuscript that contains miscellaneous materials. So a manuscript that's not trying to have all of the Bible, or all of John Smith's works, all of Darko Ilin's poetry in one place. A manuscript that's containing Darko's poetry with Katya's, with mine, that kind of mixed up thing. That's what we were looking for. And we knew that there were large collections in 4 libraries of that kind of manuscript, so that's where we went. And then lastly then, the book ownership, which is where the circulation came in handy. We're looking for all the evidence of book ownership. And again, there was so much evidence there that what we ended up focusing on was evidence of book lists, private owners' book lists. You get a kind of phenomenon in the 17th and 18th century where you have auctioneers producing long lists of books that they're going to just auction to sell. We weren't interested in that because that's trade. We were interested in individual private owners. So that kind of book list. Now, I'm spending so much time on that because that determines the results that we have. You know, the fact that we didn't look at manuscripts that were only collecting one person's work meant that you might have some really important evidence of people's perception that we just excluded. The fact that we were looking at private book owners rather than trade lists means that there's a particular kind of thing that we were getting. And that also fed into the types of reception that we found. So the way that we built our database was not via TEI tagging, not by encoding texts, but by creating what's called a relational database, a bit like the spreadsheet method that 𝐶𝐤𝐿 was showing you. And that meant we had to decide in advance what are all the types of, if we want to categorize and compare the different kinds of reception, what are those kinds of reception going to be? And this all took us, 6 to 9 months trying to devise all of this. And so we consulted kind of all of the secondary literature from historians of reading and reception, and this is the kind of the full list that we came up with. And our database, by the way, is open access, and all of the definitions of each of these are up on the database as well, so you can access all of this stuff. But even after all that work, when we started doing the analysis, there were 2 in particular categories that I really wished we'd put in. One was prayer, because there were tons of prayers that mentioned female authors, and you could only capture them as commentary, extended commentary. Down here. Extended commentary was kind of our catch-all for a piece of prose that is talking about women. But that might be a biography, it might be a prayer. There's a whole load of other sub-definitions that we might come out with. So whenever I have published on this stuff, I make a point of saying these are the other types of reception we should have included, so that at least other people in the future will be able to include them and codify them in that kind of a way. Okay, so some ideas about some visualization. If you do this kind of work, whether on a spreadsheet or in a relational database, what does it enable you to do? The reason we did it in the first place was partly because I was paranoid that all of these great postdocs and PhD people would do the work in the libraries and then get jobs elsewhere, and the project wouldn't have that research. So originally it was a way to protect the project, to kind of to store all of the research, so that if someone was kind of in the National Library in Ljubljana, that they could look at the stuff and the whole team could see what they were finding within a day or two, and we could store it and start categorizing it. This is why we had to do all of this working out of the definitions beforehand, so that we would have clear categories and people working in different places could share and store the information. But the other thing that became clear very quickly was it would enable us to see patterns. So, what are the most common types of reception? Is an obituary a very common type of reception, or is that only in Catholic religious nuns who are encouraged to write obituaries? So we're trying to kind of throw up what are the patterns, what are the big kind of pictures we might see. So that then became the reason that we then kind of realised, okay, not only is this interesting for us, it might be interesting for others. So the original database we designed is different to the open access one, because a lot of the original stuff we thought we'd find, we didn't, and you can cut that out then. So what we have in the open access one is everything that we have evidence for, rather than everything we hoped to find. Okay, so some examples of visualizations that we were able to run as we were doing this kind of work. Let me see now. So, this one is a kind of a way of trying to show how common were the different types of reception. So along the bottom here, very small. So these are things like music settings. We only found a couple of music settings. But the big ones are in the middle. So reference to named author. You can see that this visualization has failed because all it's including in the middle is reference. We had a lot of reference to named author, reference to named work. You can't see in this visualization which of these are. So a lot of experimenting with visualization, what works, what doesn't work. Here's a different visualization of the same idea, the frequency of reception types. And what you lose here is all the ones that we only had 2 or 3, which are teensy little bubbles as you go in. But you can see very clearly that the most common was reference to named author. So women's names was the most common way we found reception. Then reference to specific work was the second one. Extended commentary. So chunks of prose, that were extended pieces of prose about them, transcription, poem, and then it just gets smaller and smaller. So again, maybe a useful visualization for the big picture stuff, but not for capturing the smaller stuff. I think we had, some place ones as well. So this is just interesting in terms of thinking about how you might weight them or not. So all of the yellow bubbles are places that are mentioned. Places where people are reading the women writers. So you might be, in fact, we do have Slovenia here, you can see, and Belgrade creeping up the bottom there, but no actual yellow dots, so there was no one in Ljubljana who was reading one of our 16th century English writers at the time. But this just outlines the places. But then when you waited for volume of material in which people are reading the number of receptions, this is what you get. I was kind of amazed to find Ireland, not Galway, where I live is in the very far west coast of Ireland. No one was reading women's writing in those days there. But I was surprised enough to find Dublin and Cork. Not surprised really, because I should also have said, the first time that I applied for the funding, I wanted this to be about the reception of early modern women's writing in Europe. And they fought it back to me and said, that's just ridiculous, that's too huge, there's no way you'd be able to do that. Away you go. So I had to narrow it down. And my way of making my peace with it, because I wanted to include non-Anglophone women's writing, was to say, okay, we're looking at the reception of early modern women's writing in the English-speaking world. So if the Comtesse de la Suze was being read in the English-speaking world, she went in. One of the big female authors that came out is Teresa de Avila, the Spanish autobiographer and saint, who of course across the 16th century became a runaway bestseller. So she's in it. So that was my way of trying to find a way of including non-Anglophone writing. But this is, in the English-speaking world. Nevertheless, these English speakers are travelling all over the place while they're reading or writing letters about, I've just read this person. So that was another interesting enough visualization that we had. Some basic network visualizations, and you've already seen some of these from Katja. And I suppose one of the things to say is that, which will be, I hope, very clearly evident here, is network visualizations aren't necessarily very helpful or visually, aesthetically appealing. They're kind of good fun for playing around with, and Gephi, G-E-P-H-I, is the standard software still for doing it. Some of you I know are familiar with it. This was a corpus of a particular convent in Brussels of exiled English nuns who wrote an awful lot of letters because they were fighting with each other all the time. So this is a corpus of about 400, 500 letters produced by that one convent. Just to try to see, in this case, what we were looking at, it was the most connected nodes, so the people who are most important appear closer to the centre, and the people who don't are at the periphery. If you're in blue, you're a nun. If you're in orange, you're a not nun. And we didn't bother differentiating between those. So unsurprisingly, the very centre here, Mary Percy, was the abbess of the convent. And she had, on 2 different occasions in the 17th century, kind of revolutions from her nuns because they didn't like the way that she was doing things. So one of the things for us that this was useful for is not necessarily to present it to a group of people because it's visually appealing, but it threw up for us one of the women who turned out, Barbara Gage, who's kind of southeast Barbara Gage, who we hadn't realised was one of the major agitators, one of the people who kept on causing trouble. And if we hadn't been able to visualise it this way, we wouldn't have realised, oh, we need to go back, why is she there? Let's go back and look at her letters and see what's going on with her. So it can be useful more as a research tool rather than an aesthetically pleasing tool. Another example of this was we then kind of separated it out to filter it according to the type of reception. So we filtered it through to translation. And what that showed us was all of these men become important and connected because a lot of the nuns couldn't speak. They were having to defer to the archbishop close to them in Belgium, but a lot of them were exiled English nuns who left because of the Reformation. A lot of them didn't have a language other than English, so they had to get their confessors and priests and helpers in to help them to make the various cases they wanted to make. And if you're a scholar of Catholic history, this is interesting because in the 17th century, all convents, female convents, are meant to be enclosed. They're meant to be not speaking to men at all, in any way whatsoever. They're meant to not be corresponding with anyone apart from the archbishop. Clearly not the case. So, a couple of them, I might just kind of, rather than delay too much, do a couple more. Sorry, let me just see. Pull that off here. Okay. So, this was a question asking what genres of reception, so what genres, what kinds of source material do these female authors have in common? So where are these names appearing most commonly in terms of our source material? And these are three of probably the best known Anglophone women writers of the 17th century. Margaret Cavendish, Catherine Phillips and Aphra Behn. I'm putting a little key here. So I don't know if you can see the kind of the connections between them. The thing that's really connecting all three is what colour? Orange, yeah. And orange is the library catalogues. So part of the reason why these three are still the best known authors is that they ventured into print publication. And so if the book is available for print, it's available to buy, and so owners of libraries will have it in their catalogues. But again, that brings us back maybe to the question of understanding the parameters of what you're doing. You know, that these people are showing up most commonly because they made a decision to enter into print, and that meant that their writing was available in a different kind of way. So when you're interpreting your results, you have to sometimes ask yourself the horrible questions. You know, I would have loved to have found another writer to really transform kind of our sense of who were the top 5 circulated female authors. And we could nuance the picture of who were the most popularly circulated authors. But at the top end, we didn't really transform or change the results. What did become interesting, and I'll come back to this towards the end, is the really long tail of the huge range of authors in circulation. So the people that everyone knew about were pretty small, but the sheer eclectic range of kinds of authors who were being read all over the place is huge. We have this long, 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 long tail, and that's something I suppose we weren't really expecting. And this is one really just to show off this kind of narrowing down to the 3 most common types of source: the miscellany, the auction catalogue, and the print edition, to have them in colour. Just so you can get a sense of how populous all of these kind of these colours are. So print editions tends to hit individual authors out on their own. So you have these individual kind of isolated authors who are circulated in print, and they then become quite common, but they're not connected to everyone else. Whereas in blue, we have the manuscript miscellany, and you see that Elizabeth Tudor, Queen Elizabeth I, is our top one. That's because we were including, she was an author, but she was also a queen. So it's not surprising that her name crops up time and again, time and again. And one of the things that's interesting with her is disaggregating the places where she comes up with a reference to one of her works. So where she's considered an author, which is about 25–30% of the time, and then the rest of the time where she's just a famous woman, and that's it. So that kind of adds to the Okay, so overall picture then. By the time we got to the end of the funding, and I suppose this is something we could talk about later as well, we did consider we would just keep the project going. But in order to keep the project going, you have to have a way of cleaning the data, of double checking the data. And that's kind of a life sentence for me. So if we this is kind of one of the issues around crowdsourcing, I suppose, is. And we've took the various projects that have done this to varying degrees of success. I felt by the time we got to the end of the 6 years that we could stand over the integrity of all of our data, and if we were to open it up again without funding, then someone's going to have to either check all the stuff that comes in, or you're compromising the quality across in the database. So we decided just to guillotine it at this point. But here's what we have if you're interested in looking at the open access version. We have 1,878 female authors. Now you may go, wow! But this is authors, this is because in order to enter anyone into the database, they have to exist as a female author in the first place. So as a kind of a thesaurus of authors, or a dictionary of female authors, this includes authors from classical times up to 1700. So anyone who was known as an author writing in Greek or in Latin is in there as well. It's not just 16th, 17th century writers. It includes all known authors in any language. Because if I want to find receptions of, let's say, Anna Maria van Schoorman, the Dutch author, she has to be in the database in the first place, even if I'm looking at English people responding to her. So it's kind of a useful, I think, basic dictionary database for all known female authors up to 1700. From England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, North America, the Low Countries, Denmark, Germany, France, Italy, Spain and Portugal. I'm afraid we didn't have any that we knew of from this part of the world pre-1700. We have over 7,000 female authored works, which includes poems, plays, religious writing, histories, obituaries. That's also kind of skewed because it's skewed in favour of Anglophone works. So every single poem or play written by a woman in English counts as an individual work. For non-Anglophone authors, we put in the major work for which they were known on the basis that, as and when we found reception of an individual letter, we would put it in. So it's compromised in that sense. But as a snapshot of the kinds of material that's out there, we found almost 5,000 different examples of people engaging with female authors and their works, by 678 identified people and many more anonymous people in 1,439 different sources. Now, what is the kind of big picture stuff that we found then? So we found evidence of people engaging with 22% of all known female authors up to 1700. So a fifth of the known women up to that stage, were being engaged with in one of the ways we've identified. Of those for whom we did, so of that 22%, 2/3 were received twice or more times, but 1/3 we only found one example of them being engaged with. That's that long tail I was talking about. I'll just do the last kind of quick big picture one. 13% of what we found were anonymous, meaning we couldn't identify who the person was in any way, who was receiving, who was doing the reading. 15% people, most people were received only once. The top 10, here's our top 10 named authors. I think this is interesting because again it reveals the limitations of how we approach the issue. So Elizabeth I, no big surprise. Catherine Jones, Viscountess Ranelagh, probably not that familiar a name to people who don't study letters in the 17th century. She turned out to be an absolute linchpin in Samuel Hartnett's scientific correspondence network. She was someone who moved letters around. So she may not have come up with the ideas herself, but she was always writing up and saying, you should read this, I got this from this person, I got that from that person. So as an influencer, she was very important. Third comes Mary Percy, who you'll have noticed from the network visualisation there. Now that's really down to the stuff that we looked at. We looked at exiled English convents, and we looked in particular at this particular Brussels convent because they generated so much activity. So that's not, she's not the third most read female author in English in the 16th and 17th century. She's just the third most read according to what we did and how we calculated and how we designed our project. So I guess the key point I'm saying here for you when you get to the end of this week is think about, it's fine to design your project in ways that seem sensible to you, but be aware that that will also determine the results and your findings, and that you have to be transparent about that because that's what's going to help the research community to make sense of your findings. Okay, so a bit about desire. Okay, print publication in this period was a very, very, very dodgy thing for most women, and this is kind of one of the best examples in English. This is the cover page of a printed, a prose romance, a kind of work of fiction, which also included the first sonnet sequence in English by a woman writer. Obviously, in the 1500s, there were sonnet sequences in Italian by Italian women writers. But part of the problem was that this was an aristocratic woman who had written all of this stuff in manuscript. It was in circulation. Then she went into print and it caused an explosion. Because who did she think she was as a woman writer, publishing this major work in print? Part of the problem was she encouraged her readers to interpret the story of the fiction in light of the English court at the time. So one of the courtiers in the English court, Sir Edward Denny, believed that a particular story was actually a kind of homo à 𝐻𝐢𝐿, a kind of a key codified version of a real thing that had happened to his daughter. And the story in this prose romance is about the adultery of the wife and the father beating up the wife. and this quarterly report that reflected what he had done to his daughter and didn't want the world and his mother to know about it. Social media of its own day, if you like. So in the end, she had to retract all copies of the book, and she continued writing for decades afterwards, Mary Rose, but she made sure she circulated in manuscript. And this gives us leads me into the question of desire and why it's so hard to find records of certainly sexual desire, because the articulation of sexual desire by a woman author in any of our countries before 1800, possibly even 1850, certainly. This is why the work that 𝐶𝐞𝐬𝐢𝐫𝐚 is doing is so fascinating and interesting, because she's tracing the moment that this changes. The articulation of sexual desire is automatically to make yourself not taken seriously and exiled and peripheralised and marginalised. And so this is an example of a poem that this man put into circulation about Mary Rose after she published the Urania. He started off by calling her a hermaphrodite. So straight away the idea of a woman author publishing in print is sexualised and objectified. Hermaphrodite in show, indeed a monster, so she's transgressive in her sexuality. As by thy words and works all men may conster, all men may see. So your words, your writing is proving you to be a hermaphrodite, to be transgressive. And then later on he uses this lovely image of the oyster, which we might associate with deliciousness, but she's associated with a common oyster. Common oysters such as thine gape wide, and take in pearls or worse at every tide. Your vagina. This is acceptable at the time to say about a woman writer, because going into print, and also she published the first sonnet sequence, which sonnets are about articulating desire, maybe not sexual desire, but being the first woman in English to do such a thing opens you up to all this kind of stuff. So this is a way of historicising that question of sexual desire, but nevertheless, I ran a few experiments, not all of which are on this version of the database, so I'm just going to quickly check some of them. So this is one that comes from a very recent digital humanities project run from Australia and New Zealand that wanted to look at female-authored complaint poetry. So there's a whole genre of complaint poetry that comes from the classics, it comes from Ovid, genre of female voice. Often in Ovid, the heroides are voiced by women, but most of this poetry is kind of written by men, but female voiced. So these people were interested in what sort of female-authored complaint poetry. And they created this complaint index, which you can access, and they colour-coded the various emotions. So each of these dots up here is a different emotion. So what we have here is amatory religious. So maybe look at the top right. We have psychic suffering, love sickness, sin, love's absence, broad grievance. So this is all the grievances that you can't capture any other way, a broad grievance. Deception, physical suffering is highlighted there, love's betrayal, crisis of faith, inconstancy, guilt, isolation, inconstancy of men has its own, death, transience, lover's cruelty, which is different from inconstancy of men, rejection, God's wrath, social, political injustice, fall from grace, jealousy, desire for death, and twist of fate. And this is what they find when they look at that female-authored complaint poetry in this period of the century. Sexual desire isn't one of them, though. So I would recommend digging around there. This is just kind of their search interface landing page, just to give you a sense of the kinds of tags that they created. So rather than doing text encoding of a text, they decided, like we did, what are the types of emotion that we want to have here. The types of compassion, justice, weep, tree, stone, etc. I think that's the last that I have on this one, but just to say, I also ran a search this morning on early modern letters online. Yeah, I'll just maybe go back to that to remind you what project that is. Early modern letters online. The search result for desire there yields 1,281. I was like, God, that's great. Wow, early modern letters have desire over 1,000 times. And then you dig into them, and of course you have to disaggregate people requesting things. I desire you to send this book to someone. It is my desire that. Disappointing for sure. I also went on to Women Writers Online, which is the one that I pulled up here. Okay, so Women Writers Online, when you go on there, again, how many results? Well, the results are 115 texts, but a lot more of these, so the time frames of these guys are 1540 through to the 1840s. So, interestingly, although we didn't get a huge number of, it was 115 results, but they do them by date, and 93 results are 19th century for desire. And these are in texts by women. Now, they include all kinds of texts by women. But 93 are in the 19th century. Oops, can I read here now? 13 are from the 18th century, and only 9 are from the 7th century. And then, lastly, I did a quick one on our own research page. This is the open access research. I won't try and run this now for purpose, but I put in here, if you look for reception type under quotation, that's our kind of free text. And these are quotations of people writing about women, not quotations from female authored texts. But if you put that in and it contains, and let's just put, I put in love first, thinking love would be better, and got, I think it was 500 odd examples of love. Like, oh, that's okay. And then I would desire, thinking, oh, there'll be 1 or 2, it'll be fine. And hopefully this will work. So here you get 988 results. Now the problem is, of course, you then have to go into each result. And so if you go into this one, you can see here again, I desire that no person except you sees this paper. I beg your pardon for my bad French. So on that note, I think that kind of illustrates not only that Katja's point about sexual desire emerging in a particular way at a later stage, but also the ways in which different databases, we're all building on each other, we're all hopefully improving on each other, but the way that they're designed, the way that you design your own, is going to really determine the kinds of results that we'll get. Thanks a lot.